And hello everybody, welcome back, chapter 13, our last chapter, but it is no less important than any other chapter, and there are reasons for that, because if you don't want the song that will never end, we have to terminate the project. You've probably heard that. I won't sing it for you, you could YouTube it. Anyhow, project termination is the subject. All projects end, right? It is a state of life, right? Some project teams quickly move on to other projects. Sometimes members go away at different periods of the time. The company might be happy, they might be mad, they might be somewhere in the middle. Who knows? That's why we close it, so we know, okay? There are lots of ways projects can end. It can terminate because of extinction. Some national policy has changed and now your project is no longer applicable. Maybe it was merged with another project. I was once working for a company that had a cloud-based security program called Csfs that was being implemented, and they were also doing software-defined WAN, wide area networking, and they ended up merging those projects together. So by addition, there's which is similar to termination by integration. First it was termination by addition, and then they were integrated into a single. And then sometimes it's just starved out. Its funding runs out, for example. Sometimes it is just not possible to complete it, would be another reason. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good starter list. So with termination by extinction, this occurs in a scenario where the project just goes away. Maybe you were successful. Yay, we're done. Maybe it failed. Boo, it's terminated. Maybe the environment changed, as the example I gave you previously. Maybe it's just taking too long and it's not recoverable to match the corporate strategy. Maybe the corporate strategy is changing and your project, etc., may no longer be applicable. Termination by addition applies to an in-house project. When the project is successful, it becomes institutionalized. Say, for example, your project was to stand up a training program within the process. Once that training program is established, like using a new learning management system, then it's transferred over to operations. Now, there's termination by integration, which means, and I gave a subset earlier where two different projects were integrated, so it terminated the one and it went forward as its own. But then there's termination by integration into operations or maintenance or wherever your deliverable was dedicated to. The structure is going to absorb it along the way. And of course, it could go into then some other aspect, which is going to involve, whenever you terminate, you want to make sure that you've addressed personnel, manufacturing. They'll have budgeting issues and accounting and finance. Do they have the engineering specs needed to make sure that the project continues as it needs to? What risks have you identified from an operational perspective that you need to share? What is their precision tooling requirement, and what sort of information systems? Is it tied to a dashboard with alerting, that sort of thing? You can also terminate by starvation, which, as I mentioned, greatly involves just cutting the budget of a project, right? You bleed it out, you transfer that money out and use it elsewhere. Sometimes it's politically dangerous to cancel a project, and this is one way that can happen. Now, when to terminate a project? Well, projects, if not terminated, can take on a life of their own. They just go on and on and on. Check with any office stood up by the federal government, the Office of the Revolutionary War Surviving Veterans, right? I mean, there aren't any, but yet offices like that seem to continue. It's just meant to be a funny example of these things need to go through an orderly termination, right? So It may be easy to terminate a project when it's finished. It's really just wrapping up the paperwork and getting the customer to sign off that they've accepted the deliverable. But sometimes, and it can be very difficult to terminate a project if it's terminated early. So when you terminate it prior, I frankly see them both as the same processes. Whether I terminated at close or successfully or terminated early, I'm running the same process. There are critical success factors, or Csfs, to consider. We want to make sure that our project and closing is in conjunction with the project mission, that we have top management support for closing, that it's built around the project plan to come up at a good time, that personnel are well aware and advised of their next roles and responsibilities, feedback, and those sort of things. You have to close out the technical tasks, right, like quality engineering. You have to get the customer to sign for the deliverable. Along the way, you want to collect the customer's feedback and your team's feedback and make sure that you continue to communicate and troubleshoot until it's turned over. So there are reasons why projects fail, right? It does happen. Maybe there was insufficient support from senior leadership from the beginning. Even though the C-suite gave you the business case and you build a nice charter and the detailed plan to go with it, you didn't have senior level support. We could all name examples where that's happened to us. Maybe the wrong person was the project manager who wasn't in a course with us here, right? It's true. Maybe it was poor planning, right? Lack of attention to detail. You know, Churchill once said that no matter how great a strategy, you have to look at the results, right? For in the results, whether good or bad, will let you know how you handled the details. So sometimes poor planning can be an issue in that regard. There are also non-technical reasons. Political, we just mentioned on the last slide. Sometimes it's cross-cultural and others along the way. The book describes those quite well. So in the termination process, first, you have to decide to terminate. Now, you, the project manager, will make a recommendation. So, for example, what's a good reason to terminate? Well, if your project can no longer achieve its objectives, that's a reason to terminate. You won't decide that. You will collect data, do analysis, which means you create information, and do a report. Recommend it to your sponsor first, and then to others as appropriate in your communication plan, right? So first you decide to terminate. If your charter can no longer be met, if its high-level objectives are no longer achievable, that would be a good reason to recommend termination, for example. If the decision to terminate the project is made, then you have to then follow the steps and carry it out. Now, sunk costs are not a reason to terminate a project. We know projects are unique. We know that there will be some sunk costs, right? So that by itself, the real decision on whether to terminate a project early or not is, are the objectives still achievable, and are those objectives tied to corporate strategy? If the answer is yes, the answer would probably be to continue. I consider Microsoft, for example, Apple, when they were building the tablet with apps. Nobody knew what a tablet was. Nobody knew what an app was, right? They had to create apps, create an app store, create a way that apps worked, create security around the apps, etc. I can't imagine that ever went on time, but the objectives were still achievable technically, and they were tied to Apple's strategy. So they continued with it. Aren't we glad they did? So we want to implement termination when the time is right, either early or at the end of the project, right? It can be done orderly, which I highly recommend, or a hatchet job, which benefits no one. Remember, the goal is to make sure we update our reports, get the customer acceptance on whatever we built so far, and put lessons learned back on the shelf for future project efforts. So we want to implement this in an orderly shutdown that yields good results, right? I would say the project manager should lead this effort. But sometimes some companies will use a special termination project manager to make sure those skills get done. So you want to ensure all tasks are completed. Even if you finish terminating early, complete the work you're doing right now. Notify the client of your intentions. It's probably required by contract anyhow. Finish the paperwork. Yes, that's why you're ensuring tasks are completed. Any lesson you've learned along the way, you want to be able to apply here in the future, right? Send out final invoices, which means, hey, pay your bills. Make sure the resources on your team and the equipment and the facilities get accounted for, cleared out, cleaned up. Remember the rule. Return it better than you found it, right? You want to make sure legal has approval to do this, gives you approval. Keep good records, just like procurement. Solid records means everything. And then close out the project books. Now there'll be a final report, something you'll put on the shelf that future project managers and your PMO can grab if they go to do a similar project, especially in the short term. I want to make sure all my performance reporting, we discussed earned value management, for example, in this course, is up to date, whether I close it out at the end or terminate early. We want to make sure that performance reports are done, that we have updated the organizational structure and lessons learned, and any techniques or modifications to processes, policies, or procedures. Does anyone really use this stuff? Yes. Future project efforts in your PMO sure will. And your lessons learned, which is key to collection, should go into a lessons learned database along the way and communicated with everybody as appropriate. Some final notes and thoughts on this is that remember, it's closing a project or phase, so you'll also close each phase of the project. And remember, I want to confirm that the work is done in accordance with the requirements. So at the closing, I want to do a quality check for sure. And then I want to take it to the customer, let them look at the requirements, the plan, and the product, and get them to give me a formal acceptance, signed documentation that they are in agreement with where we're at, or that they recommend changes. Great. That's at the end of the phase. At the end of the project, if they have, at the end of each phase, accepted, and at the end of the project say, no, I'm going to have a problem with that because I have acceptance after acceptance after acceptance. So then you want to finalize all the activities, hand off the product with all the documentation required, and then don't forget to close all of your procurements. You've frankly been closing procurements or contracts as they end anyhow during your project, but now you want to really wrap them up. Make sure you collect feedback from your customers, from your team, from your key stakeholders. Make sure you update your final performance reports, right? So they are current, whether you terminated early or terminate at the end. Those are lessons learned up to that point. Money has been spent. Let's learn something for it. And then we want to archive and index the records and make sure lessons learned gets accomplished, collected, and shared. Okay, and make sure you cover the technical aspects. Update the work breakdown structure with things you've learned. Update the comp plan. Update your stakeholder analysis based on things you learned along the way. Okay, that was fun. I've enjoyed it. See you online.